God has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Hi everyone, welcome to Unapologetic. I'm so excited to be speaking with Holley Gerth today. She is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author, life coach, and counselor. She has sold over 500,000 books, co-founded the groundbreaking blogging community Encourage, and now co-hosts the popular podcast More Than Small Talk. In her latest transformative book, The Powerful Purpose of Introverts, Holley shares what you need to know from brain science to the psychological, relational, and spiritual aspects of being an introvert. She also reveals exactly what will help introverts beat their struggles and maximize their strengths so they can live with clarity, courage, and confidence in a world that needs what only they can give. I am so excited about this talk. Thank you for being on, Holley.
Thank you for having me.
So we talked off this. We were supposed to do our talk in person because we were both in Nashville at the same time, and I got very ill, and so this is our reschedule. And I mean, ever since I've looked at your work, I was like, oh my gosh, she has to be on this show, because I just love people understanding how God created them and that was on purpose, and really understanding what the purpose of certain personalities and giftings really are. So I'm so glad you're here, but we'll jump right in. Question I ask everyone: what do you wish Christians would stop apologizing for?
I think being human, having emotions and making mistakes and setbacks, not getting it right the first time, all those unrealistic expectations we have for ourselves that are just not what God has for us.
That's a great answer. So being human. So that's what we're talking about today. And you have the book, we introduced it, but your new book, The Powerful Purpose of Introverts. And we're just going to jump right in to this and say, of course, for some reason, there tends to be a cultural bias that we all need to be extroverted, or we need to try to put ourselves out there, or the shy little child needs to try to put themselves in the front of the classroom. So let's jump right in. Why are introverts important? Why is it an important thing to own and understand?
I think introverts and extroverts are an intentional complementary pairing that God put into the world. We look at the story of creation and we say day and night, masculine and feminine. I really believe introvert and extrovert. About half the population is introvert and about half is extrovert. And there are a lot of even well-known people you might not guess are introverts, like Oprah, Tom Brady, Joanna Gaines. And so we often just have misconceptions about introverts. Yeah. But I think that some of our skills, like listening well, thinking deeply, seeing the bigger picture, are great traits that our world needs now, just as my beloved extroverts are great at being a voice for the voiceless and reminding us to reach out and include people. And I think that God just really designed us to team up and we're better together.
Absolutely. So do you have a definition that you like for what extrovert and introvert means? People say it a lot, but without really understanding what those two terms mean.
Yeah. I'm going to borrow one from Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet. And she says introverts have a preference for minimally stimulating environments. So we are at our best when there's a bit less going on around us. And so that's why we might love having coffee with one friend instead of being at a dinner party, or being able to really focus and go deep into creative work instead of being in a bigger meeting. And so I love that definition because we tend to think being an introvert or extrovert is about people. And it's not. Introverts and extroverts equally love people. People just happen to be the most stimulating thing in our environment. And so they can be a bit overwhelming for introverts after a while. But it's not about how we relate. It's just about how we engage with our environment. And so I guess the contrast would be that extroverts are people who thrive a little more with a lot going on in their environments. And I know people fall on a continuum. No one is totally introvert or extrovert. We land somewhere along the line. And that can even change a bit over a lifetime. I don't think we switch types, but we shift a little bit on that continuum. So I love that we have both parts to us. Just one is more dominant. It's kind of like being left or right-handed.
Okay, I've never heard it explained that way. I remember whenever I was in school becoming a counselor, they're like people, because you have to listen to how people describe themselves. And so a lot of people will describe themselves as introverted or extroverted. But you're right. It always had to do with in relation to people. I've heard it explained this way, that it's how you're re-energized. So like extroverts are energized by being around people and by being stimulated, and introverts are re-energized by being alone or being in less stimulating environments. But other than that, I mean, is that really how we should think about ourselves? I mean, I know people that really is how they introduce themselves. Like, hi, I'm Julia. I'm an extrovert. Like, I don't say that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it really becomes like their entire identity. What do you think about that? Do you think that's good or?
Yeah, I think it's helpful as a description, but not a definition.
Oh,
and
good.
I think there's a difference. And so if we are using introvert, extrovert as shorthand, you know, when we're introducing ourselves, it helps us get to a place of understanding maybe a bit quicker. But I think if we make it a box where it defines us and we say, I can't go outside this, or I can't imagine you going outside this, that's when it's not helpful.
Right.
So I love it as a tool to learn some things about who God made us. I don't love it as something that we use to limit us or even make excuses, you know? So yeah, helpful as a description, probably not as helpful as a definition.
That's so good. And I think about just, you know, so many of us obviously have been in crisis in the past few years with everything going on. And sometimes when there's a lot of chaos, it provides clarity to know, like, okay, I'm having a hard time, but I'm introverted and I'm not getting a lot of alone time. Or I'm extroverted and because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to get my normal energy level. I think about that too, just being able not to put you in a box, but it does provide clarity when maybe you can't figure out why you're having a hard time or why a job doesn't suit you well or why you're exhausted in some situation. I've definitely seen that in ministry. It's, it can really exhaust people that are more introverted if they're constantly having to be around people all the time. And then the opposite is true too. If you have an introvert that's in a job where they're isolated all the time. So what do you think? Yeah. Should you try to work through it, or do people need to change their environment if that's not necessarily doesn't go with how they're wired? What would you say for that?
Yeah, well, in my story, I found out that I was an introvert in college, but didn't really dig deep into it until a few years ago. I started publishing books, and I thought that meant I'd be more of an extrovert. I just told myself that this is the job. You know, this is a job now. I have to speak all the time. I have to be out there. And I had a year where I spoke 20 times, and on the last engagement, I was the keynote Saturday night, and Sunday morning, I couldn't stop crying. And I felt like God said, go home. And I knew he meant like, go home as in get on the plane, go home, take a nap, girl, because you sure need it. But also go home to who I created you to be. Yeah. You know, go home to who you are designed to be. So God created each of us on purpose for a purpose. So the way that we are made fits his design for our lives, not someone else's, not the person we envy on Instagram or that woman we look up to who's so different from us. But for us, we are equipped with what we need for our purpose.
That's fascinating because I had the opposite story where I was trying to make myself really enjoy alone time and not being around people. And I think definitely like in the Christian community, depending on gender roles, not ones that are biblically defined, but ones that are more like a woman does this and doesn't do this. I went through that like as a new mom of, oh, well, this means I'm supposed to do this. And I was like, God, like no matter what happens, like I am not interested in this. And God really freed me from that. Kind of like what you said, it was, this isn't how I created you, and that's okay. And so I don't think we hear that message a lot from introvert or extrovert. Like it's okay if this is not conducive with how God made you. I want to ask you, because a lot of people do know these terms and maybe they recognize them in their spouse or in their children or people they're around. But this just needs to be like Introverts 101. Where do introverts really thrive? Like, what are the jobs? What are the situations? What kind of relationships? What is their thing that they just really excel at?
That's such a great question. And really, we thrive when we can focus deeply. And so if you imagine, again, like one of my favorite things is to have coffee with one friend and like we have a meaningful conversation for 2 hours and I don't have to focus on anything but her. Or I have a book chapter to write and I get to go deep and I don't think about anything else but that book chapter. And so we often thrive, again, when we aren't as distracted by things in our environment and we can go deep. That's what we really love. And I think, extroverts, y'all are great at going wide.
I'm an introvert. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, you're right.
like I have an extrovert daughter and I love her because she always has someone at her house. Like she has widened my world so much because she's so good at bringing people in and she can go deep too. We have a lot of great conversations. So I don't want to feel like I'm stereotyping anyone, but naturally introverts are going to be in their sweet spot when they're free to go deep.
Mm-hmm. And so what about the stereotype that they would prefer to be alone? Is that true?
Well, it depends on what they're doing.
Okay.
So if you're doing creative work, if you've just had a whole lot of stimulation, then introvert nervous systems actually need time to recalibrate. Right. Because it comes down to brain science. We rely on a different neurotransmitter. We use a longer brain pathway for processing. Like there's some very real biological differences. And so when we hit our done point, it's not mental, it's physical. Like our nervous system is like a net that gets full. And at that point, until we have time alone to process what's in there, it's uncomfortable to take on more. It's like you've eaten until you're full. If you keep eating, at some point you're like, oh, this is just too much. And that's how it is for introverts. And so we process well alone because there's not more coming into our net. But the healthy thing is to have that time to process and then we re-engage. So especially for parents, I say, if you've got an introvert kiddo, look for that pattern of engagement and then retreat for restoration and then re-engagement. Like it's only cause for concern if there's all withdrawal, no engagement.
Right.
And so I think that's a helpful way to think about the rhythm that introverts need. We need people, absolutely. We just also need some processing time.
So what neurotransmitter is it that's associated with introvert, what you're talking about? Yeah.
So extroverts, y'all thrive more on the neurotransmitter dopamine, which I'm sure you know all about. And it's more like caffeine. It revs us up, prepares us for action, And so that's released when there's a lot going on in our external environments coming at us. Introverts rely more on one called acetylcholine. That's released when we can turn inward and again focus deeply. I say instead of caffeine, it's like herbal tea. It's calming. And so introverts, if we have too much dopamine, it feels to us the way we would if we had a whole pot of coffee. Like we're a little jittery and we're like, oh, this was fun at first, but now I'm done. This is enough. And so that's one big distinction between introverts and extroverts is how we engage with those neurotransmitters.
Okay, so then we need to talk about whenever people are trying to make someone kind of do something that they're just really not wired for. And I just picture like I see this with parents all the time, like a child that clearly is not wired towards being in front. And it's like, but we have to, like, in order for them to be successful in life, we have to push them to the front. They have to become a speaker. They have to be able to. So is it possible, twofold, I mean, you're a parent, is it possible to rewire? Do you need to learn skills that are outside of how you are? Or do we just need to embrace, I mean, what is the balance here of embracing how you're wired and pushing yourself or other people in your lives towards maybe developing different traits, for lack of a better term?
That's a great question. One of the biggest ahas I had when I did the research for my book was that introverts and extroverts experience happiness differently because of that neurotransmitter that we just talked about. So for extroverts, happiness feels like enthusiasm and excitement. It's a high energy emotion. For introverts, happiness feels like calm and contentment. It's a lower energy emotion. And so often what's happening is with the best of intentions, parents or spouses are looking at their introvert and saying, I'm not sure you're happy, because I can't see it. And so that's often where that desire to push a little comes from.
Interesting.
So I think the first step is knowing if you got a calm, content introvert, they're probably just good,
They're probably
and you don't have to worry about them. And then I think saying, is this something that my child in particular needs to do because it's important, like school, They may not always be comfortable there, but they need to go. And in that case, it's just getting strategic, saying, okay, my kiddo is going to take in a lot through their highly sensitive nervous system. And when they get home, they're probably going to need half hour in their room completely by themselves. And if they have no words in the car coming home, that's okay. They're just doing their thing to be restored. And so I think just tuning into that too, what our people need. And then what they want, if our kiddo's like, I want to be president of the United States, well, then speaking's probably important. So figuring out how to do those things that really matter to the people we love in a way that fits them. Like I didn't stop speaking completely. I just realized I can only do a certain amount of events a year. I need some margin before I leave and after I come home. I do better if I take a safe person with me. And so I think it's about first, ask your people, what does happy feel like to you? And when are you most happy? And then what matters most to you? What do you really want to do? And then if some of those things are hard for you, what do you think will help? And make a plan together. So I think it's just really about intentional conversation.
Good. Okay. And then if your child probably doesn't have that insight and can't necessarily articulate it at a young age, just really would be watching, I guess, and seeing the patterns.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. Okay, so you can just do a little diagnosis of me. Why are so many of my friends introverted when I am not?
Yeah, because you're a complementary pairing, like my daughter and I, or like when I go to a conference, the first thing I do is try to find a designated extrovert, to help me work the room.
Okay, that's hilarious. That is so funny.
And they're like, all right, I'll help you work the room. If someone starts crying and wants to talk for 2 hours, you got to take that. And I'm like, okay, we're good. Let's do this. So yeah, I think because we are a complementary pairing, most marriages are introvert-extrovert matchups. There's a few that are the same type, but most often we pick someone different than us. And I think in that case, it's just saying, okay, there are things about you that make me better. There's things about me that make you better. How can we use our differences to work for us?
Yeah, that is so. And then I'm just kind of thinking, about the spiritual gifts, like different ways we're spiritually gifted, because the Bible talks about, of course, that we're all one body but many members. And really in ministry and in our work, we talk about counseling and life coaching. Different people react and connect with different kinds of people.
Yeah.
And, we've been in student ministry for 13 years, and there are certain students that would rather talk to someone that's more mild-mannered and that really is going to listen. And then there are people that just connect. People connect with different personalities for sure. You hear that a lot with counselors. People are like, I just didn't like that counselor. Okay, well, go to another one.
Yeah.
Find someone where that is what you need. And it's interesting to me because, of course, we have words to put to these ideas, and we went to school for this kind of stuff. But to me, it's interesting how it seems like your brain just knows what it needs and who it needs. You just naturally, there are times where it's like, I just know, I know that I'm reaching out to my introverted friend. That's what I need right now. But it's not like I sit there and think about that. Should I text an introvert or an extrovert? It's fascinating how you naturally gravitate, I think, towards who or what you need.
Yeah. And even how much time alone we each need.
Yeah.
They found relates to some other neurotransmitters like oxytocin, which is a connection one. And so we are each built with a level of social interaction that we need to be at our best. And it operates like hunger or thirst. So exactly what you were describing. Yeah. You felt like, okay, I'm hungry for a connection where I can have someone really lean in and listen, you know? And so I think what happens is in our world, we override that. You know, we crave time with people or we crave time alone. And instead of honoring that, we say, I shouldn't. You know, I shouldn't need time alone, or I shouldn't need to be with people so much. But I think understanding that's part of how God intentionally designed us. You know, each of us, because obviously, like if someone's going to be a pastor of a large church, they probably need a higher, you know, level of social interaction that they crave. If someone's called to be an artist where they need to be on their own creating, then they probably have a lower built-in level. And so instead of shaming ourselves over that in any way, just pausing to say, okay, I'm going to pay attention to that. I'm going to honor that.
And you know, I'm thinking about just as an author as well, like to write, I have to be alone, of course. But then I have to know, like whenever I'm sure for people listening, like you make a schedule of writing when you're going to write and how you're going to do it. Most people do. But I would have to know, like kind of the flip side of what you're saying. Okay, I'm going to be alone for like 4 hours writing. So I better plan something really fun for that afternoon. Because even though I like concentrating and I really enjoy writing, I need people. So like even just how you organize your day, I'm thinking about vacation. So many people, even if it's just time off from work, like your downtime, I would imagine is very different from introverts and extroverts, what they think is fun. Is that correct?
Yeah, because probably introverts are going to enjoy things that are a little more low key, you know? You go to the beach, maybe you want to hang out and read. And the person you're with is like, what? Let's go, you know, hit 5 museums in 3 hours. And so that's when, you know, you need intentional conversations too, to say, okay, we are wired differently. And both of the way we're built is good. Just how do we make that work in everyday life?
Right. Okay, so I'm glad you said that. So where, if it's like a wife listening to this conversation and she's like, oh, this must really be what my husband and I are dealing with, or this is what I'm dealing with a friend. What do you think, like, what are those conversations that people need to have with those important people in their life that maybe like they don't understand each other's dispositions?
Yeah.
Like, where would you start?
Yeah. Well, one tool that I like, and individuals can do this, but it also works well, especially for couples, is making a list of all the things you do in a certain amount of time, like a day or a week, and putting a plus by the ones that energize you, the minus by ones that drain you, and a question mark if you're not really sure. And so like with your spouse, after that amount of time, you show up and compare your list. And if somebody's got all minuses, that's probably something to talk about. Yeah. Or if somebody has all pluses, because really you want to mix of both. Like none of us are going to get to be in our comfort zone all the time, but we also should not be in our stressed out zone all the time. Right. And so that's one way to start evaluating and just learning about each other. And again, having that happiness conversation, saying, what does happiness feel like to you? Or like if you're going into the holidays with a mix of introverts and extroverts, asking what would make the holidays feel really happy to you? And you might get a variety of different answers. And then you pull out the calendar and say, how do we make that happen where it works for everyone? So I think it really just comes back to those intentional conversations and honoring who we are rather than shaming. And then having some strategies that we use that helps everybody stay in their sweet spot as much as they can. Right. No one gets to have that all the time, and that's okay. But as much as is possible, figuring out how to serve each other well.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about, because I'm not sure that our culture really allows much space for introverts to do their thing. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah. It can be a hard choice and also a lot of guilt around it, I think, especially for women. You know?
Really? So I think the opposite. So I've found people really react to extroverted women like, oh, like stay in your lane. You're supposed to be meek and humble. And, Yeah, that's interesting. So what? Okay,
Huh.
so what go into that. Why do you say it's harder for women to be introverted, do you think?
I think that there is the strong silent type that is acceptable in our culture for men. There's no equivalent of that in females.
Huh.
A strong silent woman is not the same thing, you know, and especially when an introvert woman needs alone time and she has to take it by moving away from her, not moving away literally, but taking space
Right.
from her kids. Our culture a lot of times says that's selfish. Like you shouldn't need that. And you just need to suck it up and keep going and serve your people. And that can be hard to overcome. And I think the turning point happens when introverts know, oh, I'm actually better able to show up for my people if I do get that space. And so I encourage introverts to schedule solitude like they would an important meeting.
Wow.
And
how fascinating.
And that may look like, you know, a chunk of time. If that's absolutely not possible in the season of your life, it's just working it in where you can. Like Joanna Gaines says, before she goes into any event, she sits in her car by herself for 5 minutes. Because that is all she's got in this season. But she says that's enough for now. And so I think even if that's all we have time for, all we can give ourselves permission to do, saying it is okay if I sit in my car by myself for 5 minutes, so that I can then go in and be the best version of me for my people.
It's just fascinating because I totally understand what you're saying, because I just flip it in my mind, because mine is, you know, we have triplets, and I was on bed rest for 49 days in the hospital. And I mean, I couldn't get what I needed. Like I needed the energy, I needed the people. And then a lot of us, of course, during the pandemic, you couldn't do really what you needed to do. And that would be the same for introverts too, because everybody was at home. So you didn't get alone time, and then extroverts didn't get fun time. Really. Yeah. So I remember thinking I just need to embrace this. And I tried, but at some point you just have to really realize how God's wired you, and that's for a purpose. So I guess you do the best you can with whatever chapter you're in, while realizing this is definitely how God made you, and that wasn't a mistake, and it's not something that necessarily you need to change. Do you think that I just wonder how introverts and extroverts, in your opinion, fit into gender roles or stereotypes? You spoke to it a little bit, but I guess mainly, especially in the church, or in how do you see that, or do you see that?
I would say that the cultural stereotype for leadership is often an extrovert male, especially in churches. And so that, obviously, there are a lot of extrovert men who are great leaders. But for introvert men who are leaders and lead differently, that can be a challenge. Or for introvert and, in some ways, extrovert women saying, in some ways, I don't fit this ideal that's been put in front of me. And what do I do with that? And I love that Scripture gives us so many different kinds of leaders. Like we have Moses, who appears to be an introvert from all indications. He's like, don't send me to speak, you know? And then we have Peter, who can't stop speaking, you know, and everything in between. And so I think the beautiful picture that we get from God's heart when we look at his word is that it's all good because he made it that way.
Right.
You know? And so when we feel, I think it's recognizing when we feel shame, because shame is about who we are. It's different than guilt. So if we feel shame and are saying things like, I need to be more like, or what is wrong with me? Pausing and saying, what expectation or ideal have I taken on that isn't actually from God? It's from culture somewhere. And because we live in a broken world, that's going to happen. But it's okay to pause and realign with who we're designed to be.
Yeah. And it can be clues. Like I'm thinking about when I was a therapist full time, I loved it. I loved the work. It was important work. But being one-on-one is not my favorite thing. And so part of that job was also speaking. And I realized how much I liked speaking and teaching. And one-on-one was great and important, but it just wasn't, that just really didn't go along with how God made me. And so I think about it as like clues. It gives you clues along the way of how God wants to use you and really how you're most effective. I mean, if you look at it from a Christian perspective, like we are supposed to be ministering, we're supposed to be helping people, we're supposed to be sharing the gospel. And so if we look at what energizes us or what depletes us, like that goes along with our life purpose. I would think.
Yeah, definitely. And one big aha I had, especially like with speaking, was realizing there are people who love it. So I should get out of their seat, like let them do it. And so I think sometimes we feel like we have to be the person to do it all. Yeah. But if we are telling ourselves, I have to, and God is not actually asking that of us, then we're probably in someone else's seat. And the most servant-hearted thing we can do is to lay that down and go do what we're made to do. And so I think we often feel guilt and pressure to do it all, but we can rest and say, like you did, we are part of the body of Christ. And if this needs to get done, then there is someone designed to do it.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I'm going to go fulfill my spot and trust that God has someone for this.
Okay, so I'm going to end with this. I'm sure that you know names off the top of your head, but who are just some of the famous introverts? You referenced it, people that we wouldn't think of or in history or culture or the Bible.
Yeah. So, I mentioned Joanna Gaines,
right.
Tom Brady, Oprah, which makes sense when you think she's really famous for listening more than talking. She's a fantastic listener. C.S. Lewis, Jerry Seinfeld.
Seinfeld?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Does he say that?
Uh-huh. He and Oprah had this conversation about how they're both introverts.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and so often what we see is an introvert in a particular role where they're using their gifts, and then they often look like extroverts.
Interesting.
But after they're done, they're probably ready to go chill out for a while. And so there's, about, like I said at the beginning, about half our world is made up of introverts. So whatever room
even
you're in,
performers, like some people really are still performers and comedians and speakers, but it's just how they get re-energized is by being alone. Interesting.
Yeah. So often a particular role, an introvert will look extroverted for a while. And I guess the same would be true. Like you said, writing, like you can flip into introvert mode when you need to get some creative work done. So when we're passionate about something, it can motivate us. But
yes, true.
Yeah,
that's great. That's a great way to say that. That's awesome. Okay, so just because we're closing up, but I could talk to you forever. Best advice for parents who are parenting a child that is not the same as they are. They're the opposite.
Get curious.
Okay.
We so often just assume everybody's like us. And so we, with the best of intentions, try to do what would make us happy, and make us feel loved and all those things. And so if we can just pause and say, I'm going to get really curious about who God made this kid, because they're pretty amazing, even though they're different than me. I think that's a great starting place to just ask questions, listen, and honor what you hear, even if it's different than you would probably answer.
Right. Man, that's fantastic. I love that. Thank you so much for being on this show. I know everyone listening, including myself, learned so much from you. Can you just tell us how to stay connected to your work, where to find your books, all of that fun stuff?
Sure. Yeah, you can go to holleygerth.com, and my name has an E, so HOLLEY, Gerth.com, and I have a free 1-minute quiz that will tell you what % introvert you are. So that's a fun thing to take and find out, and have your people take. I've had so many people say, I thought I was an extrovert. Turns out I'm an introvert.
I'm going to go
and
take that
even
after this.
change things like careers because they suddenly understand why they're feeling burned out. So that can be a helpful tool.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for writing this book, first of all, because I know that it helps so many people. But thank you for coming on today. And I just really enjoyed speaking with you. I know it helps so many people.
Well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to Unapologetic. Remember that you can listen to today's episode and more wherever you get your podcasts and at ptv.org/Julia.